Hello and welcome to Redeye. And today I'm joined by Jonas Ehinger, Gapwaves CEO, to talk about the most recent quarterly reports and some other questions. So warm welcome to this.
Thank you, Forbes. It's good to see you.
Likewise. So perhaps you can start off by telling us about the most recent Q3 report, the main highlights in your opinion. I mean, this is a quarter with record sales and positive EBITDA, which is very impressive. So please give us your take on that.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned very important highlights of the report. Obviously, business is strong, and the revenue as well as the result is reflecting that. Obviously, during the period, the third quarter, we entered into the agreement with Bosch, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that later in this conversation. But overall, there's a lot of interest for Gapwaves technology. There's a number of projects ongoing, so we feel quite positive about the future.
Well then, let's start with some questions. So I mean, you mentioned the deal with Bosch, and you have some other extensive agreements with other tier one suppliers to the automotive industry. So could we talk a little bit about the process and different revenue streams that you expect to generate from these agreements?
Yeah, that's a good topic to discuss a bit around. And I've tried to explain this before, and I know my predecessor did that as well. But typically, it's a relatively long process where these tier ones, they approach us about potential antenna for a new radar product, and they often have a pretty good idea of the specifications that need to be met by the radar sensor, thus the antenna, and what the antenna needs to deliver. So there's a discussion. There might be, some lab tests very early on, but typically we try to engage in a pre-study with these customers for them and for us to understand what specifications are really must-haves and what are good to have specifications. And the pre-study typically outlines that pretty well. We do it together with the customer, and then there is a discussion typically around a development project to develop this antenna, because in the pre-study and very early in the development discussion, there might be one or two prototypes just as proof of concept. But then if the results are positive, then they typically want to discuss how to develop the antenna into a version which can be produced in large volumes. That's the development project. So then we enter into that development project. There's a number of prototypes in a development project, and a number of prototypes, and they kind of evolve, so they become more and more production ready, the prototypes. And then obviously in parallel, typically there's a discussion around the supply and or license agreement, and ultimately, we want to set up the production agreement early on also in those discussions. Typically, that's done more or less in parallel with the development project. Obviously, the customer wants to know, okay, the production unit, what will that cost? Because they need to meet their business case. So it's pretty much done in parallel. But it's a relatively lengthy discussion before you get to an agreement, like the Veoneer or Hella agreement or the Bosch agreement. So it's in some cases it varies between the customers. In some cases it can be 18 months. Other cases it's been 6 months.
Yeah, and I mean, tied to this, you receive something called non-recurring engineering revenues from in parallel with these development projects. So is this something that you're receiving from all like 3 communicated automotive agreements currently, and what can you tell us about the size of this at this time?
Yeah, not all of them, because the Veoneer agreement, and Forbes, you remember, it was the first one we did back in summer 2019. That's a pure license agreement. So essentially there was knowledge transfer and some engineering effort that was paid for before we enter into that agreement, because they had this kind of pre-study, discovery phase, if you want. But after the agreement, it's been pretty limited because it's a very classic pure license agreement, and so they do all the work. We gave them the kind of the design, the rough design, etc. But they went ahead and decided to produce that on their own, and would, of course, contact us if they needed further help. But I think it was progress at that point in time. As for the Hella agreement and the Bosch agreement, obviously there's quite a bit of engineering work going on together with them. So obviously that generates revenue for us. It's simply hours and prototypes. So we develop hardware versions of the antenna, which are being shipped and delivered to them, so they can test it in their settings and their lab settings with their upcoming radar generation.
Very good. And I mean, a final question on this topic is something that we've been seeing more of the most recent quarters, and that is that you're selling, for instance, test equipment, gap test, and also another sort of equipment that is essential for the production process. So please tell us how you've been able to make a sort of business out of that as well, and what your thoughts on this is going forward.
Yeah, it's 2 equipments. One is used to assemble the antenna. That's called a stacker, or gap stacker. And the other is testing equipment. All the antennas need to be tested and calibrated. So, and that's called a gap tester, obviously. And we have production in-house at Gapwaves, much smaller volumes and different applications, but it's for under and smart micro, etc. So we have a need for doing that in a streamlined way and cost effective. So we develop these equipments, and obviously a production partner, which is a factory company essentially, like Franken, they use a lot of automation also in their production, of all kinds of things for their customers. So obviously they realized, okay, but these equipments are custom made for Gapwaves antennas, so why not use them? And that's really how it started. And also other production sites have expressed interest. There's also another site at Hella which will utilize these equipments. So we have a line here, and cycle time is very quick, so it's fully automated. It's essentially a robotic system, and there are some key components that are very, very specific to Gapwaves, which we also try to keep confidential, because those are intended only for us or our production partners and our customers, and are not to be let out in the market. So these products, to just finish the answer to your question, is these products will be dedicated to production of Gapwaves antennas, either internally or with our external partners and customers.
Great, exciting. Okay, so moving on to some of the automotive agreements that you have. So far, you have communicated one end customer. I mean that your one design win essentially, that your supplier has won with your technology, and that is via Hella. And I want to ask you about how your communication around these design wins will look like going forward. And will you receive information on design wins from your partners, and how will you be able to talk about this to the markets?
Yeah, that's several questions, but I'll start with our plan to communicate. We will we will communicate whenever we have that information, and then when we're allowed to communicate it, obviously. So the tier ones are requiring quite strict confidentiality from us, and I'm also pretty sure that their customers, the OEM, the car manufacturers, also require confidentiality from the tier ones as to what models will have what type of radar solutions and radar sensors, etc. So I think there is a certain complexity here with companies not wanting to let information into the market too early. But from our perspective, we have an inherent interest to communicate it to you and to the market, obviously. So as soon as we can, we will do that. And also have in mind that there are different design wins here. You know, a design win for us means that the tier one has entered into this agreement, you know, based on our technology. Not necessarily the same design win as a tier one winning a contract with an OEM. So you need to keep those two different design wins in mind. You know, and we will communicate as soon as we can and as soon as we are allowed. I want to mention that and make it very clear that we always strive very hard in our agreements to be able to communicate to the market. And sometimes we succeed. In other situations, they really don't want to give away too much information to their competition. You know, the tier ones, that's probably one of the most competitive markets in the world, I would say. So it's a very tough discussion.
Mm.
But our default point of view is always that we need to communicate this to our market and our shareholders, of course. So yeah.
And just a follow-up regarding the timeline on these design wins. For instance, for a typical corner radar agreement, how long before the production phase does the OEM need to communicate this? I mean, choose the technology. How long in advance?
You mean how long in advance the OEM communicates or the tier one communicates?
How long before the actual production does the OEM need to select this technology?
I think that they select a few years in advance, and so that tier one can also set their technology into production. So I think we need to be like ready a year before the tier one goes into large scale production, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the tier one needs to be ready 1 year before the OEM goes into production, minimum. But I think the decisions are earlier because of you know, car industry. They have pretty long lead times and very long cycle times around their car models, etc. But if when it's all decided, I think pretty much a year is what tier one need to ramp up, and they will give us the same type of time window to operate within also. So the component suppliers, like in that case Gapwaves, they need to put their products together before, so it's ready with the tier one, and the tier one enters into large scale production. They produce and send it to the OEM. So it's kind of a chain. It's a very interlinked system.
Mm. Okay. Thanks. And let's move on to the competitive situation for Gapwaves within this automotive ecosystem. I mean, one of your more well-known competitors is Hoover plus Sooner. But are you noticing any other competitors in this space?
There has been some rumors which we're looking into of others trying to produce waveguide antennas. Now that is traditional waveguide antennas, similar to what Hoover and Sooner might be doing or what they're doing. But we also know large-scale production of traditional waveguide antennas for these frequencies is rather complex, and it's quite demanding from a precision point of view. And it's also involving a number of production steps, which are challenges that I think Hoover and Sooner are addressing, but it takes a certain skill set in a company. It's not just about molding plastic. Because there are very high precision requirements doing traditional waveguide antennas. And that's also, as you know, one of the advantages of Gapwaves technology, that the precision requirements, mechanically speaking, are much lower, which makes it more suitable for large-scale production, because the precision requirements are more relaxed and it's easier to produce, simply. But there is no doubt in our mind that there will be more competition as more and more enter into this frequency range for their radars. There will of course be more and more attempts in getting into this. If they go down the route of traditional waveguide antennas like Hoover and Sooner, probably they will be facing a rather complex production setup, which is impacting the cost advantages. But as you know, the automotive industry in China, for instance, is huge, and there's a number of Chinese tier ones that are not really active outside of China, but they are active in China. And you know, long term, I guess they'll try to expand internationally also, at least a few of them. So we have that in mind, obviously.
And more competitors developing this type of waveguide technology, that might be something good to make it more common in the automotive space. Or what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And let's be realistic also that, you know, in the automotive space, they never go single source. They try to always avoid single source, right? And that will probably be the case here also, but it also helps us. So if Hoover and Sooner wins some contracts, then other tier ones will look to other vendors such as us, and so I think it will be, it's like an ecosystem where there's a number of vendors competing, and we have some strong advantages. Now you also have to distinguish between standard radars like corner radars and front radars and the future very high resolution radars for imaging or imaging like information. That's a few years down the road, and but that's, for instance, where Bosch is aiming with their contract with us. That's an imaging type of radar. There is nothing like it on the market, and we're now developing that with them. And in those cases, our advantages are even bigger because we can make the antenna very compact and again very cost effective to produce, and also with very high performance versus traditional methods. And the complexity, if you have a very high resolution type of radar and antenna, the complexity of that antenna is many times higher, and that makes it even more difficult to produce, especially in high volumes.
And staying on that note, I mean, you've talked in previous presentations that you're looking at other segments within automotive, and I assume this is one of them, right? So could you talk about this this offering and the potential here?
Yeah. When I've mentioned that, I've been thinking about other verticals in the market, not traditional automotive, meaning cars like we own and drive personally or individually. I'm thinking about other types of vehicles and not necessarily cars as we think about them either. But it could be anything from robotaxis to trucks, working vehicles or work vehicles like for mines, farms, harbors, very big warehouses, etc., and even flying vehicles. They all have a need to perceive their surroundings, right? And that means that they also have a need for high resolution information. Otherwise, you need a lot of sensors, and in some of these equipments, it's not practical to fit too many sensors into it. And then you want a stronger or better performing radar, for instance, because then it might replace some of the cameras, etc. Cars will use a big number of sensors. It will probably be LiDAR, 1 or 2, but also a big number of cameras, 8, 10 cameras, and you know, anything from 5 to 12 radars, and a number of other types of sensors. But in some of these other vehicles that I've mentioned, you cannot really do that, or it becomes too expensive, etc. So volumes are much smaller in these segments, but price elasticity is much better, you know, meaning higher pricing and higher margins for us and for other suppliers to these types of vehicles. So that's what I've been indicating or referring to.
Right. And in developing this technology for this new segment, how does the competitive landscape change if you look at the traditional automotive space?
Yeah, like I said, the trend is moving towards higher resolution type of radars, and that's working for us, you know, because of the complexity of antenna, and we also have different technologies. It's not only the original Gapwaves technology. We also made an acquisition during summer of kind of a sister company or a technology that was also developed by the same professor, Per Simon Kildal, which is that company was Metasom. We acquired the remaining 75% of that company this summer. We already own 25%. So that's a different technology, especially well suited for high resolution antennas, and a different production technology also. So we're not only advancing or further developing our basic technology, we're also adding other technologies, and more importantly, we're also very specifically targeting the manufacturing of these antennas to have a very efficient and competitive manufacturing ability, and eventually also generating patents from the production methods and the way to manufacture these antennas. So all of these areas are very important to us right now. So we're spending quite a bit of attention on those.
Yeah. Right. And another big topic these most recent months has been around the Bosch agreement. You are taking a more active role in the manufacturing, testing, and so on, because you will be delivering complete products to Bosch. So let's start by what potential and benefits do you see with going this way?
Well, basically, the most fundamental topic or aspect is that we can retain a bigger portion of the margin. If an antenna or a radar sensor has a certain price, obviously, if we just license out our technology and somebody else is producing it, shipping it, etc., the margins will be limited or more limited. But if we can do that, it means that we keep a bigger portion of the gross margins for that product. Obviously, it also coincides with what I mentioned before, that we have in-house production, so we can share those investments and resources and also continue to develop the production technology. You mentioned gap stacker and gap tester before. For instance, those are things that we can spend more time on to improve our position, but also our partners' position when it comes to producing the antennas, not only developing it. So that's very important. We can also keep a closer relationship with the customer, because these customers, they pitch towards the car manufacturers, the OEMs, and obviously the OEMs have many different car models. They have different life cycles of the car. So obviously there are always projects upcoming for new cars, and it's always a question of which radar sensor generation goes into which car, etc. And by having these much closer relationships directly with the tier one, where they order antennas from us and we deliver the antenna, regardless of the antenna being produced in the Gapwave facility or with a third-party factory, for instance, it doesn't matter. But we have the relationship with the tier one, and that means that it's easier for us to be part of their future plans and their future process towards the OEMs also, and the next car generation or the next car model. So there's a lot of strategic value also in having this position. Otherwise, you're kind of, you're a supplier to a supplier, and that means that there's not a lot of influence that you can have, and not a lot of margin either.
And I share your thoughts on that, and the benefits really do seem very compelling. At the same time,
there's also some investments associated with it, obviously. So let's be clear on that. But I think having a mix of external and internal, etc., there where Gapwaves can focus more on the most specialized and most complex antennas, and we have partners, factories, which produce other antennas at certain volume, but still they produce it for us, and we supply the industry and the tier ones with the antennas. I think it's a good combination, and that gives us more tools in the toolbox.
Right, and which are going to be the largest investments? Is it personnel, technology, bigger facilities? What are you seeing there?
Right now and in the near future, it's personnel, because we are gearing up towards achieving and fulfilling the Bosch agreement. We have several years before we're hitting really big volumes there. But there are a number of things that need to be accomplished. So right now it's about the brain power and manpower in Gapwaves. We're hiring antenna engineers to engage in more development projects, but we also need more manpower to fulfill the commitments we have and the expectations we have from our partners and customers. Going forward, not in the immediately near future, like we just talked about, we will have to ramp up our own production capability also, and source more third-party partners for production as well. So all of these things need to be addressed, but shorter term right now, it's about brain power and manpower.
Excellent. And all right, a final question then on telecom, the 5G offering and everything around that. What is Gapwaves' take on this? Because communication has been quite limited the most recent quarters.
Yeah, it's limited because I typically get the question, and it's always the same answer. You know, where we've learned a lot in telecom because that was the main area of focus up to say 2018 or so for Gapwaves, and we had quite a few projects, etc., with telecom industry. But it also turned out that the telecom industry is not utilizing the frequency bands with higher frequencies, and below 28 gigahertz, etc. Our antenna doesn't really add any performance benefit compared to traditional patch antennas. And I guess the industry will move to higher frequency when there's a need to do it for like bandwidth or performance. But right now it's still in below 10 gigahertz, so it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for the industry to invest in this, and it certainly doesn't make sense for us to keep pushing technology which has no real application right now, large scale application, I should say. Of course, there are some ongoing projects, and we still keep our eyes on that market. And there are some specific applications, like within satellite communication, etc., that could materialize for us earlier than the broad kind of 5G segment. And then I think during the last year or so, I'm sure you picked up on the early kind of indications of 6G, and for sure 6G will utilize higher frequencies, and so I actually see us as a given stakeholder in when that development happens, but not until we are utilizing, or the industry is utilizing, the higher frequencies. And obviously there are some technical adaptations that we will have to do once that happens with the frequencies and frequency utilization. But I think that's not fundamental in the same way. So you and the viewers here and our investors, I mean, we can all keep the eye on the telecom industry. I think we will all know once they start to utilize higher frequencies, and that's kind of the starting point for us.
I understand, and it makes sense given that there are more compelling opportunities that are materializing now. And do you have any final comments to close this quarter and looking ahead?
No, not really. I think you've covered some of the more important aspects, and also some of the questions we typically get when we meet investors and shareholders. I know the timelines are difficult to kind of grasp concretely, but they are relatively long, and the work that we start now might materialize in 3 or 4 years in large scale production. But that's how the car industry works. And I also want to emphasize, the good thing is that once you're in with a component in a system, the likelihood of being kicked out from that is very small, very small. And there are very long timelines for this. So a life cycle of a radar system in a car might be 7-10 years or more. So I think once we've entered into these agreements, the longer term future looks very positive. And as you realize now, Forbes, we always try to have a mix of revenue. You've seen what we've done with Hella and Bosch and Veoneer in terms of license fees, etc. So I feel pretty confident that we have a number of tools in the toolbox that we can work with in these interactions and when discussing contracts, etc., with these partners. Today we haven't really talked about tech giants, but it's kind of similar. Tech giants might be targeting a certain type of autonomous vehicle, etc., but they're even more secretive than the tier ones. So of course we'll communicate with with regards to that, as soon as there is additional information that we can communicate, and then that they allow us to communicate. But there is ongoing work, obviously, as communicated before.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for those answers. Very helpful to understand this company, and I and many others look forward to seeing how this growth story continues. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Forbes, and everyone else. Thank you.